Let me tell you first, before I forget, why I left. I left after 10 years for, I suppose, two main reasons. Three reasons. The first reason was that by the time I'd been in the police for 10 years, Margaret Thatcher had been also in power for 10 years because she became Prime Minister the year I joined the police. The good part of that was that she raised police salaries at a stroke by 23% just before I joined. Now, that should have been a warning sign, because why does any leader ever raise police salaries? The answer is the leader knows he or she is going to have need of the police on his or her side, which means he or she knows that his or her policies will be unpopular. And Margaret Thatcher's goal, among other things, was to break the power of the trades unions. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen the film Pride, which came out recently. I recommend that you do go and see it if you haven't seen it. It's a great film. It's all about the support which the gay pride movement in London, mainly, gave to the striking miners during the lengthy 2-year miners' strike in the UK. Now, this was a real showdown between the government and the unions. It must be said that back in the 70s and early 80s, the trade unions were all powerful, and that was the reason why British manufacturing was in such dire straits, because they couldn't manufacture anything properly because the unions were so powerful, they were always striking. I'm into cars, and British Leyland cars from those days were terrible because they were always on strike, the workers. So it's true that the relationship was very much skewed in favour of the unions, and Margaret Thatcher's goal was to break the power of the unions, and she succeeded in doing this. Thanks to a 2-year strike, which involved a lot of bloody battles, an awful lot of acrimony. The miners, obviously, once they were out on strike, were not receiving their salary from the coal board. So the actual miners' unions, the National Union of Mine Workers, the NUM, had to try and give them enough money for the strike to hold and for people to be able to put food on the table. And it was a very difficult situation. The National Union of Mine Workers, you probably recall, was led by Arthur Scargill, who was a real firebrand, a very strongly left-wing, almost communist politician, and he was a huge figure. And over the 2 years of the strike, the whole country was in turmoil. And we, the police, were used, we were the thin blue line, as we call it in English, between the strikers and the government. And to give you an idea, during the 2 years of the strike, many of my colleagues tripled their salary with overtime. There was so much work involved, and we were sent all over the country to police the picket lines and deal with the strike. Now, one of the things we did during those years was, an example would be that there was a lot of striking in Yorkshire. That was one of the hot points of the strike. And so the police would send flying teams down to London, for example, and they would stop the buses full of strikers from going up to Yorkshire. Now, that is not legal. One of the reasons we have a rule of law is that people are allowed peaceably to protest about what they don't like. So actually stopping people getting into a situation where they could protest about something which was tearing the social fabric apart was completely illegal and immoral. And that's what the police were doing very frequently. Another reason why I left was that during my tenure in the police, the Americans were installing cruise missiles in the UK. Now, Gaspard, mon fils. Now, you may be aware that the UK is often called an American aircraft carrier, because the UK is full of air bases for the Americans. And at that time, it was deemed useful for the second strike capability, using Pershing cruise missiles, to be stationed in the UK. And one of the big bases that was going to be used for stationing the missiles, RAF Molesworth, was on my area. And so the police, we were used to police the base and to make sure it was secure, that the missiles could come in and go out. I remember, actually, one of my most vivid memories was the night the base was first opened for the American missiles to arrive. And Michael Heseltine, who was who's nicknamed Tarzan, Michael Heseltine was the defence minister, and he was there telling the police we were doing a good job and praising us and all the rest of it. But what was happening was that during the time when the missiles were being installed and being maintained there were lots of demonstrations. There was the peace movement, there was Greenham Common, which was down near Oxford. That was another base, and that became very famous. And there were permanent pickets trying to picket the movements of the missiles. And people had a perfect right to do that, because people don't like missiles. In a democracy, they had the right to say so, as long as they don't break the law. Whereas we, the police, were given instructions to be very strict, shall we say, with the strikers, just like we were with the miners, and to go, quite frankly, far beyond what the law ethically enabled the police to do. And so that wasn't right again. It was another instance where we were actually working against democracy rather than working for democracy, because for me, the role of the police in a democracy is to lock up wrongdoers, keep the peace, make things secure for people to go about their daily business, and also to allow people to protest legally, which is one of the basic premises of democracy. And this we were not doing. And the third factor after Margaret, yes, I didn't mention this first factor properly. The first factor after the cruise missiles and the miners' strike was Margaret Thatcher's policies as a whole were very draconian policies. She's a very right-wing politician whom I didn't particularly see eye to eye with. And in a democracy, after about 10 years, the corpus of law starts to resemble the law of one party, because in 10 years they had time to abrogate all the laws they didn't like, to strike them down, as you say in English, and to pass into law all the laws which they wanted. So the body of law by 1987 was a conservative body of law. And to me, again, the law should be above these things. The law should not be partisan. That's why on the Old Bailey, the Courts of Justice in London, the law is a woman with her eyes bound carrying a pair of scales, because she's blind to partisan politics. She is blind and neutral. And yet we were not neutral in those days. The body of law being applied by the police was not neutral. And it has to be said that the police very rarely turn around and tell politicians to piss off. If politicians say to the police, you will do this, they do it. Because complete policemen are by their very nature conservative people. They like the status quo. To a policeman, anybody who's actually protesting against anything is per se wrong. I'm sure this speaks to Caroline, because I know what her politics are like, and she's quite right. And that is a mindset which I struggled against in the police, because it shouldn't be that way. But it's inevitable that the job of policing will attract conservative people. It's just inevitable. You're not going to have many left-wing firebrands working in the police, which is why I left. The third reason why I left was because I was fed up with taking orders from idiots. And it has to be said that the average policeman is not very intellectually gifted, shall we say. And that's fine, but I didn't mind doing my job as long as there was a good reason for it. And the dictum which we policemen on the ground applied to senior officers was, don't confuse me with the facts, my mind is made up. They didn't want the facts, they didn't want to know. And so that became harder and harder for me to take orders from idiots. Now, if you're in a normal job, which is not hierarchically like the police or the military, then if your boss is an idiot, no names, no paxills, you say in English, you can ignore him or her. But in the police you can't, because it's a hierarchical institution, you have to take orders, and it became harder and harder to swallow. As the English say, it used to stick in my craw to have to take these orders. So I finally decided I'd like to do something else. Okay, I have another 2 minutes left before Vincent has to go. Let me highlight a few of the things I actually did. I spent a lot of time in various specialised parts of the police force because, as a graduate entrant, I was destined for high things and quick promotion, so they wanted me to have a chance to taste all sorts of different parts of the police. So I did, obviously, my 2 years on the beat, which is just the ordinary foot patrol. Then I did the drug squad, which is very interesting. I did the regional crime squad, which is what the French call the l'anti-gang, which is organised crime. That was very interesting. That we were armed most of the time when we did those jobs for the regional crime squad, the RCS. We would be armed. I spent a year in the rape squad, not raping people, but investigating rapes. And funny thing is that people on the outside think that the way in which society treats rape is wrong, which it very frequently is, because the courts and judges and magistrates and policemen are very much not sympathetic to women's plight, women who are the victims of rape, but it is a terrible, terrible thing. It's an awful crime. And yet what you probably may not be aware of, and I am aware of this because I was in it for 2 years, is that a lot of rape allegations are in fact false. because it's very easy to allege rape against somebody. It can ruin their life, it can destroy their reputation, it can take away their job, and it's easy to say. That's the problem. So I would say that of all the rapes which I investigated, maybe 4 out of 10 were completely fabricated. They weren't rapes at all. So there are both sides to the argument. One side is very much clearer than the other side, because only if you're in the police do you really see that you can fabricate allegations of rape. That was very interesting. And then for 2 years I was in the traffic department, which was a lot of fun. Now traffic was great fun because I actually helped to write the book called Roadcraft. Now Roadcraft, which I could go on about for hours, is the book which is the British Police Driving Manual. And it relies on what we call the system. There is a system applied to how you drive fast, because obviously in a police car you can't go around killing people. It doesn't look good in the press. So you have to actually drive fast but safely, which is an unusual conjunction of words, fast and safely. And so the book Roadcraft applies a huge 500-page book, and I helped to write this book because I have all sorts of theories about driving, as you may or may not be aware, including the famous arrowhead theory, which I will go into another day. And this book rules the police driving system. Now, to become a police advanced driver, a patrol driver, where you would pursue villains, you have to go undergo about 20 weeks of training. And what we would do, we'd go in an unmarked police car, a powerful 3.5 litre Rover. We'd use the same cars as we used for traffic patrol, and we'd drive 8 hours a day. There'd be 4 of us in the car, 3 tutees and 1 tutor. And we'd drive as fast as we could, 8 hours a day, on the road. And that was a lot of fun. Learned a lot of things about that, and learned how to drive fast and safely. It was quite an experience. Also, you have time to give feedback to anybody?
See.
Right. I will draw to a close and just conclude by saying that one very interesting thing about the police driving system was that we had patrol cars with calibrated speedometers. So obviously to catch speeders you have to have a calibrated speedometer, and we calibrate them by using a tuning fork. You'd hit the tuning fork and the speedometer, which was digital, had to show a certain figure, and it's indicated it was calibrated, and that means if you went to court, you could say to the magistrate or judge that you had calibrated your speedo, and that meant that we knew how fast the cars would really go, much slower than the manufacturers said. Anyway, so that's enough for now, and I will talk more about the police at a later juncture. Thank you.